So, welcome to another lecture series from Public Management. We're going to be thinking today about internal control and auditing in general, in particular within the context of multi-level governance. The case is going to be from the EU and it'll be on the European Social Fund. There are really just two sort of mini lectures this week. The first is going to be a new approach to how we can classify different transitions, organizational transitions. And the second, we're going to be looking more in detail at internal auditing and internal control. So let's start then by talking about transitions. So the idea that Watkins proposes in the first 90 days is that we could, very much as we are able to say characterize organizational forms along the sort of five-part prototypes of Mintzberg, he proposes five configurations of conditions that characterize an organization when a leader enters into it. So basically you can come into an organization as a leader, whether you be sort of a lower level public manager or sort of high level executive. And you can face different combinations of conditions that can be roughly characterized and sort of can provide a sort of shorthand way of getting insight into the potential sort of impediments, obstacles you might be facing in trying to come in and manage effectively. And in particular, he mentions five prototypes of these conditions. So the first is going to be a startup transition, which is where you're launching a new venture or project. You might also have a turnaround transition, which is where you are, in essence, saving some business or initiative that's in serious trouble, right? So really where everyone knows that there's problems. A realignment transition is one where there might be some issues, but in essence, this organization or company is facing problems, but not everyone completely recognizes it. So that's going to be more of a realignment. On the other hand, you might end up in accelerated growth, which is where you're dealing with rapid expansion of an organization, so very similar to a startup, except you're growing quite quickly, or sustaining success, which is where you're following the footsteps of a highly regarded leader, where everyone believes it is quite successful. So your goal is to again sustain success. Now, in reality, you may come in any of these cases and have a slightly different diagnosis of the situation than say other people might. But these different configurations are often quite based off of what the people in the current company right then perceive as being organizational status and prospects, if you will. So again, this is his sort of START model, so that's why he has it. STARS model, which is why he has it set up in this this way. And so this is his text directly from his book, with the idea that in a startup you're working on assembling everything into some sort of new technology or business initiative that can get off the ground. You can imagine that much as you might have startups tend to be very flat organizations, so you're having to get the people, build the structures, and making do with very limited resources, and there are a lot of demands on you as a manager. On the other hand, you have a lot of opportunity for direct control. You can recruit people that are very energized, and there are often no rigid preconceptions. So, for example, one thing you might think of is that for the SPPU unit itself, they're basically in a startup mode, even though overall the commission itself might not be in startup mode, but the SPP unit was, and so there's going to be a different sort of, if you will, set of obstacles to getting work done within SPPU as opposed to those in which SPPU is interacting with the rest of the commission or even with Parliament. With a turnaround transition, this is going to be an organization that's acknowledged to be in serious trouble. So people are saying, there's a problem here, we've got to fix it. And we've definitely seen that in some of our cases where the employees are often demoralized. They are sort of all stuck in heavy, if you will, resistance mode, often not purposeful resistance, just people who are so paralyzed with fear they can't really make things done. You have often time pressures, and it can be difficult to make effective decisions and get everyone on the same page and get them energized. And it can be quite difficult because you might really have to, in some organizational things, like basically get rid of people, especially if you face financial difficulties. The nice thing, of course, is that people recognize change is needed, and people that are in some way being affected for it can also provide some external support for change. Because again, organizational change is always difficult. So in some ways, if you have to make a change, these turnaround conditions in some ways give you a sort of good start, at least at trying to get it done. But there's still a lot of work to be done to be effective because people are so demoralized and often fleeing the organization. You've often lost talent. Accelerated growth, in essence, things are growing quite rapidly, very similar to a startup, except for the point is that you're having to constantly sort of, basically, you have a lot of technostructure building to be done because you're having to put in place a lot of structures and systems to permit this scaffolding growth. And the nice thing, of course, is that people will tend to be motivated. They'll tend to be hardworking. Again, very similar to a startup in that sense. The sort of more negative side effects, of course, is again stressful, and it can again be particularly stressful as you have to transfer power from the person who sort of starts everything up into the people who start taking over the more systematic or systemization of the entire organization. A realignment transition, like a turnaround transition, there's some organizational failure that's on the horizon. It's just much further away on the horizon. So this is an organization that's been quite successful and is facing some sort of a mixed problem. So in this case, it can be quite difficult to convince employees that change is necessary. You're going to face potentially not just resistance, but also a lot of interference and backlash because people still have the energy and the desire to pretend like there's not a problem coming. One of the most difficult things to do can be basically navigating these existing status hierarchies. So very much a lot of the cases we've been looking at have been realignment transitions. The nice sort of opportunity is you've still got some pockets of strength. They want us to continue to see themselves as successful. So the trick is to get them doing new things without completely undercutting the sense of success, but also sort of helping them see that it can help them be more successful and confront sort of these limited challenges. Sustaining success then is when you're coming in and something is already seen as quite successful. This can be really problematic coming in as a leader because you're always being held up to the shadow of what the former leader is. It can make it quite difficult if you embark on a lot of different initiatives, like again, resistance, interference can be quite high. The good thing, though, is in theory, you should already have good people and you shouldn't have to take a lot of steps. Now, again, because these things are perceptions, it could very well be that certain employees within a unit might see themselves as successful, while people outside that unit may not see themselves as successful. So again, the conditions you might face within a unit might be those of sustaining success, but within the wider organization, you might be seen as being in a realignment transition. So figuring out how to play that and understand these different perspectives is also an important thing. Not something Watkins deals with a lot, but I think given the approach that we've taken in this class, it's an obvious extension of how we can think about Watkins is not just saying that these conditions are always the way that everyone sees them in the same way, but instead understanding that it's perceptions of these conditions, these sort of mental maps of what the organization is that can really lead to these different responses. So let's think then about in each of these transitions where our initial conditions are and what the ideal end conditions are. So if in a startup we think that there's sort of nothing but sort of an idea, maybe some resources, but there's no status quo, no routine. The idea, of course, is that you've got some business venture that in the end is poised sort of for that next transition, right, which is the growth transition. With a turnaround, you have an established business with a real strong fear of failure. So there's a lot of collective threat attribution. So again, if you go back to the resistance, interference, backlash, you can see all the negative things that threat attribution can do. And also some of the positive ones, and then it actually lessens the possibility of backlash. The goal, of course, is to end up in the end condition of a healthy business with, or a healthy organization with morale and reputation restored. That should sound somewhat hopefully familiar from this week's case. It's something to keep in mind. A realignment is that you've got some degree of shared understanding of the need for some disruptive change, but there's still some legitimacy of the status quo. So again, you're more likely to have people sort of fight back and say, I don't know if I want that much change. Ideally, though, you should actually be at the end of this sort of being ready for sort of this big success-sustaining transition where everyone's sort of firing on all cylinders, where you have people that in the case of success sustaining, or sort of you end up with an organization that is capable of being adaptable. Everyone is sort of involved and committed. Because you already, again, have high legitimacy of status quo. So what you're trying to do is build on these past successes in a success-sustaining transition. In the the types of ways we might think about specific complications and opportunities, this list isn't exhaustive, but it's certainly suggestive of the types of issues we might face in these different transitions. Is one of the big impediments in a startup transition might be, say, for example, reliance on an entrepreneur. Also, you've got more concrete things like, a lack of resources, no routines to fall back on, a lot of environmental, basically, uncertainty and gray space, right? But the opportunities are that you have very few constraints on what you decide to do. And again, there's a lot of opportunity for the leader to have their vision enacted. So an example of a startup transition you might think of as early stages of junta. Though again, part of what we see, in fact, in our case, is we're actually seeing them in more of a growth transition, where they've got this one thing that was sort of working and then it stops working as they start to grow, so they see they need to fix it, right, so they can maintain growth. With a turnaround transition, you tend to get this fatalism or collective threat attribution. You tend to have a lot of pressure from the authorizing environment, which again can actually be used to your advantage, but is often ends up leaving your employees and even your managers feeling like a deer caught in headlights. You're going to tend to see a lot of blame game, everyone pointing fingers at each other, and a lot of wanting to revisit prior issues. Ideally, people should be open to change, and fear can itself sort of aid forward movement when it's set up in the right way. So you could imagine that the ESF case that we're looking at this week might fall into this situation. The SVPU case we looked at last week, at least from the commission's viewpoint, might have fallen into this situation right after everyone gets fired. With realignment transitions, you're going to have more resistance to change. You're going to end up with potential turf wars, a lot of not in my backyard type of thinking. And also, anytime you start to backtrack, you can end up sort of having a lot of fear and actually increased backlash. So it can go both ways. It can be both fear and it can be seen as weakness, and people can start to attack. The opportunities are that you might be more successful at eliciting active employee participation than where everyone is quite afraid. And there's opportunity to actually create some opportunity attribution, which of course also is true in any of the more positive transitions, and even some of the negative ones. You can always have the opportunity for opportunity attribution, but it's a real feature that you can create, or that is useful at least in a realignment transition. And again, a lot of the cases we've looked at really probably are best characterized as realignment. The organizations aren't failing or even perceived completely as failing, but they're facing struggles that might ultimately undercut where the organization is hoping to go. It's probably the most common situation you're going to find yourself in as a manager, is in essence sort of facing some sort of a realignment transition. Success-sustaining transitions are where everyone already thinks everything is great. So there's going to be a very high resistance to change. But it could be that you can come in and build on top of prior wins. So in essence, as long as what the organization is doing is going to keep leading to it being successful, you can in fact build on it. And we'll see we'll look at some of the unique aspects of success-sustaining transitions when we start looking at the Air Force in the next, I think, week or two. So that's closer. We haven't really seen much of one, I think, up until this point.